So I was looking back at the Philosophy for Flourishing podcast and trying to figure out when you were last on the show, and it was more than 2 years ago, back in 2021. So Hannah Frankman, thanks for coming back. It's a pleasure always to speak with you, and especially to have you on the podcast.
You made me wait so long to come back on the show. I was thinking
Oh,
about it too. I was trying to remember the last interview we did. We've talked plenty, but it's been a while. A lot's happened.
yeah, and something in particular has happened that I thought, oh, well, I just have to talk to Hannah about this. Because last time we talked, you were working at Praxis and you were doing a killer job over there. And you were just starting a course for Objective Standard Institute on opportunity and
Mhm.
how to like find opportunities, spot opportunities, leverage them, and just build the life that you like out of those opportunities. And lo and behold, you've gone and found and created really this really cool opportunity, something that you're working on that I know you're passionate about. I know you have a lot of experience with, and we talked about that last time we talked. So we don't have to rehash all of that, but I'd love for you to just kind of lay out what are you working on these days? Why am I so excited, and why should other people be excited about it?
You're prompting me to talk about my favorite thing, my projects. Um, so I, about a year and a half ago now, I launched an alternative education media brand called Rebel Educator. I actually launched two projects at the same time, which I'll get into in a moment. But Rebel Educator is a very public facing half of what I am doing. Um, Rebel Educator is an education media brand that is very like our philosophy is very pro everything that is not institutional government school. So we are building the central resource hub for parents who want to exit the status quo institutional education system and find something better for their kids, whether it's they want to start homeschooling, they want to find a micro school, they want to find some type of private school, they're interested in an online school, they want their kids just working on projects all day, doing apprenticeships, like whatever parents are looking for, we want to help them find it. We want to help them validate their intuition that something about our system is very broken and very rotten. And then we want to help them figure out, okay, so I have this feeling that something's not right about my kid's school. What on earth do I do next? We want to walk them through that process. So I started Rebel Educator. It's grown quite a bit on Twitter. We have a website with a publication full of content that parents can use to find resources for where to go next with the education of their kids. I also have a podcast that I launched a few months ago, as you are aware, the Hannah Frankman podcast, where I interview people about education. That's why I have this fancy setup because I got to pull out my interior decorator and think about like set design and stuff, which was super fun.
Fantastic work.
Um, Thank you. It's still a work in progress, but it's getting there. Um, so I also am doing that, and then the other project that I launched simultaneous to building Rebel Educator was a branding agency that does the same types of things that we do at Rebel Educator with other clients too. So I feel like I just started building out lots of different opportunities all at once to the preamble that you gave about the opportunity course leading into this. Um, so yeah, I'm working with some other clients too, doing similar types of like brand building work with people who also have big fiery visions about how the world ought to be, taking everything that I've learned building Rebel Educator and helping people build that out too. So that's the short version of what I'm up to. We can get into the weeds on any piece of this that you want, but that's what keeps me busy these days.
Well, why do you hate traditional schools so much? I mean, not really. I asked that facetiously, but what is the motivation here? Why are schools broken? What fundamentally is the problem, and how are you addressing it?
The problems run deep. The problems run really deep. They're fundamental to the structure of the system in and of itself. Um, the history of education in America is very interesting, and most people don't fully understand it. And most of my work is centered on the education system in America. Just as a sidebar, a lot of the things that I say apply to the education systems of other nations, but my area of expertise is what's happening in America. So prior to the turn of the century, we didn't have a standardized education system. in this country. And our population was very well educated. And they were surprisingly well educated. The demographic splits were different. So like in modern America, every single child is expected to be educated. There were different groupings of people in early America. There was, men were expected to be educated. Women weren't necessarily expected to be educated in the same way. Obviously, there was a slave population that wasn't being educated. But when you look at the numbers of everybody who was supposed to be getting an education, like if you look at things like the literacy rates, they actually were pretty comparable to what we have today when we have a nationally funded education system with mandatory attendance, which says a lot about how our education system today is not doing a great job. The literacy rates in like colonial America or like Revolutionary era America were about 80%. And honestly, like our competent literacy rates in America today are about 80%, which is pretty bad. So we had for the first century and a half of America's existence, we had localized education. The responsibility of educating children was on the families, it was on the local community. It was, your town had its school and it had its local school board, and that's who was determining what the kids need to be learning. There were obviously standards that were kind of pre-agreed upon on a national level. People weren't just making up on each town, going back to first principles, trying to figure out, so what should the children be learning to be ready for the world? Generally speaking, there was a lot of freedom. There was no central locus of authority. And we had a highly literate, highly competent populace. And then in the mid 1800s, moves started to be made to develop and design an education system that could scale to a national level and be run and handled out of Washington. And that education system was put into place on a national level in the early 20th century. And that education system was designed to raise children who were going to be good economic actors. So we had a rapidly industrializing, rapidly growing population full of immigrants and people who were, needed to be working in factories and needed to be working in as parts of large scale economic operations. And the people who designed the education system and the people who funded the education, the design of this education system, many of whom were the big industrial titan families of the early 20th century, were very focused on how do we raise generations of children who are going to easily integrate into the needs of this new workforce. And an education system was designed to help kids learn the skills that they need to become useful economic actors, and not too many things that were going to distract them from that. And when you go back in and you look at the literature of the people who were designing the education system, they were not interested in giving kids a well-rounded education that was challenging them to think critically or to develop their creative capacities, because it was just going to be a distraction. And they felt like the kids who were ending up in private schools, like we have enough wannabe poets already. Like we don't need the general masses to know too much about poetry. It's going to distract them, and it's not useful for the humble problems that they're going to encounter in their lives. It was very elitist. And so we ended up with an education system that was intended to homogenize a population full of immigrants and help them integrate into an industrialized economy. And so the product of this education system, the products being the children graduating from the system, the outcomes were reflected accordingly. They weren't being taught how to learn on their own. They weren't being taught how to find information independently and build a lifelong habit of learning. They weren't being exposed at any great length to the standard liberal arts. The kids who are really highly academically competent and interested were moved through the system towards more academic trajectories once they came out of the primary and secondary levels of the system. But that was not the intention for the average student. The intention was to have a population of kids who are good at following rules. They understand how to work in large groups with each other. They understand how to listen to the bells ringing and go to the next place. They know how to take tests. They know how to memorize the things that they're supposed to memorize. And they're prepared to work in environments that cater to those skill sets. So the entire system is predicated on the idea that that's success. Kids who are good at those things are successful. And that leaves a lot of really important things out, like the ability to think independently and question things and rationalize for yourself whether or not something makes sense or whether or not it's something that you want to do. Kids don't have any chance to learn any autonomy, any self-direction, any personal responsibility. Someone else is always responsible for you. The amount of responsibility you have is always constrained to the small set of choices that you're being given inside of the classroom, where everything else is being decided for you. And kids aren't being exposed to the academic subjects that are going to help make them creative and innovative thinkers. And so, I mean, arguably a lot of the great innovators that we've had in the 20th century, and there's a lot we can get into here. I have a lot of hypotheses around the trajectory of the education system in America mapped onto the trajectory of the innovations and the progress that we've seen in America since the inception of the education system. I can't prove them yet, but I have thoughts about it. But when you look at the people who have been super innovative, all of them are people who did terribly in school, and they just kind of like were so stubborn that they were able to succeed in spite of the system, not because of it. So the system itself is not set up to help kids thrive. It's structured in a way that's intended to help them do well inside of a system, but not to be able to break out beyond it. Which, you know, whether or not that was moral and good for the 20th century is a separate debate from whether or not it's useful for the 21st century. The answer to that is a resounding no. And parents are starting to realize that, and parents are starting to ask a lot of questions about why outcomes weren't great from the system in the first place, but why they are deteriorating now, and why test scores are getting worse and academic outcomes are getting worse and literacy rates are getting worse. And so people are trying to exit the system, which is why I'm doing what I'm doing, because there are a lot of parents looking for options and I'm trying to help.
You're showing people to the door. That's such a,
I hope so.
it's a really good summary. It reminds me of this great, probably apocryphal Mark Twain quote. I've never let my education, or I've never let my schooling interfere with my education.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, if you look at the 20th century educators and the educators of educators, the people who are teaching the teachers, primarily John Dewey and his protege, William Herd Kilpatrick, they were staunch admirers of the Soviet Union. I mean, William Herd Kilpatrick, both of them vacationed there, but William Herd Kilpatrick went and saw kids doing a group project. They were picking up roadkill off the street, and he thought that this was great because they were learning how to be social and how to use these skills in a social setting. And you sort of pose the question, perhaps these ideas were good for that time, but no longer. But I think, as kind of a simple way to put this is independent thinking a value? Is it good for children to learn how to think on their own, or is it better that they're told what to think, sorry, told what to think and told that they ought to follow authorities? And when you ask the question like that, to ask it is to answer it, right? Because what parent? I recently became a parent, and this is already on my mind. I have a 4-month-old, and my thought is like, how do I encourage him to interact with the world in such a way that he starts to gain his own knowledge of how things work and some confidence about how to deal with the things around him, how to even use his own limbs. So it's this value of independence that I think people are starting to realize schools completely exterminate, or to a large part do. Now, to play devil's advocate for just a minute, do you think that this problem is part and parcel of the, I'll call it, government school system? Are there opportunities for people to work within the government school system? Or is it something that you just need to get out of entirely?
So, first of all, there's a distinction in terms that I want to make because I think it's really easy to just like lump public school and then everything else is two separate categories. And I don't actually think that's where the split lies. There are a lot of private schools that are basically the exact same product as public schools, but with a couple minor modifications, and then you put a different logo on it, basically. Um, a lot of private schools are also running the legacy institutional education model. And so I think that's an important distinction to make when you're thinking about exiting the system. There are a lot of innovative schools that are doing things very differently from the public school model, but there also are a lot of private schools that are running a very similar model to the government one. And I think, again, that's just a useful thing to like think about. We can get into that more later if that's helpful. But I think that's just like an important distinction in terms. So can people do good inside the system, or is it better to exit? I talk to a lot of teachers on Twitter, especially. I have a lot of educators that reach out to me or that are really active in my comments. And it's an interesting split of people between like if someone's attracted to the work that I'm doing, they're either coming in to tell me that I'm spouting nonsense and I'm a grifter and I'm being grossly irresponsible by telling parents that they can dare to educate their own children when they're clearly not trained experts the way the person holding a teaching degree talking to me in the comments is. So they're coming in to argue with me, which is great. I love the discussion. It's good. But so they're either coming in for that or they're coming in because they're dissatisfied with the system and what I'm saying resonates with them. And those people fall into two camps. One camp is people who are just like dying to get out of the system as quickly as possible. The other is people who feel a responsibility to stay and they want to do as much good as they can within the system. And some people do. Some people are doing a great job inside the system. Like, I mean, it doesn't matter what happens. I don't think public education in America is going anywhere anytime soon. It's still going to be the largest market share. They're still going to have the largest market share of students, no matter what other innovation happens in the short term.
Try.
Yes. But like realistically speaking, probably they're going to have the largest market share for a while. So a lot of kids are going to be there. And there are a lot of teachers who do really good within the system that actually do encourage a love of learning for their students. They do challenge their students to think critically. They expose them to projects and opportunities. There are educators doing incredible work inside of the system who I have deep respect for. It's not the teachers that are like the teachers aren't, it's not their fault that the system sucks. They're just stuck inside of a terrible model and doing the best that they can. So I do think that people can, inside of the system, they can work a lot of good and impact a lot of lives with the students coming through. But I don't think that meaningful change on a large scale is going to happen inside of the system because it is just such a bloated and top-heavy bureaucracy that the amount of mass that you have to turn, the amount of inertia that you have to fight against to shift even a fractional degree of a direction and difference is so absurdly hard and expends so much energy that it's just like not worth the effort. The innovation that's going to meaningfully change things is going to happen outside of the system. Most likely what's going to happen is a lot of schools are going to start emerging that are direct competitors to public school. People are going to start pulling their kids out, and then the public schools have to actually compete to maintain some level of market share. And that's where, like, if you're forcing from the outside, that's where change is going to happen, if it does at all. But generally speaking, if you can get out of the system, the level of agility that's freed up to make change and do better elsewhere is so much better than what you can get inside of the system.
Yeah, regarding the bureaucracy, I believe it was Arthur Bester who called it the interlocking directorate. basically saying that what you have are these teachers unions and all these government agencies that have the only have incentives to keep themselves in power and to keep the system that we have in place. Unlike, private educators, at least they have the incentive to provide a good product. You mentioned earlier that many of them don't. Many of them sort of ride the same wave that the public school system is riding. But um, at the very least, those people are responsible and answerable to parents. And parents, of course, like I'm a parent now, and I totally get like if you're tuned into your life at all and your own wanting what's best for both you and your child, then one of the most important things that's going to be on your mind is getting your child a great education. Speaking of which, so okay, you're showing people the door, but what sorts of tools are you giving them to sort of vet the options out there once they've left the public school system? What is good? What is bad? How do you tell the difference?
Yeah, eventually we probably will have actual tools. Right now we just have articles with a lot of guidance. So I think this is part of what keeps people inside of the system as long as they stay, is that it's really hard to find options. And once you've found the options, it's really hard to know what you're looking at. Like the product information that exists on schools is very sparse, and the level of helping parents feel competent in knowing what they're looking at when they're looking at that information is even sparser. It's really overwhelming and daunting, I think, for a lot of parents. And so they stick with the status quo because they are afraid of finding something that's worse than the status quo. Like at least the status quo is a known quantity, even if it sucks. Um, and I think like once you start understanding what you're looking for, it's not a daunting prospect anymore to evaluate schools. There's so much there to like start to understand, oh, like do I want which educational approach do I want, what kind of model am I interested in, what kind of like student teacher ratio do I want, what kind of like grade level split do I want, a mixed age classroom, do I want an emphasis on like my kids working on projects all day, or do I want like a stronger academic focus, do I want them to be in a school where they're learning to debate using the Socratic method, do I want them somewhere where they're getting like a purely classical education. Once you start knowing what you're looking at, you start to be able to parse out the differences between what these different models are and how to think about them. But until you know what you're looking at, until you understand the language, it's overwhelming. Which is part of, I think, one of the most important things that I'm trying to do is make that feel a little less daunting. But I think, first of all, before I give parents any practical advice, I usually try to instill in them some level of confidence that even if they have trouble knowing which school to choose, the probability of making a critical or fatal error is very low. I have seen kids bounce between multiple schools before landing on one that was a good fit for them. And when they finally landed on one that was a good fit, they absolutely thrived and they caught up on everything that they'd missed. I think that parents should be a lot less afraid than they are of moving their kids between different schools until they find one that's the right fit. Like you're not going to do irreversible damage to your child's education by having them in a couple schools that aren't quite right before you find the right one. Obviously, you should be striving for the right one, but you're not going to make some grave error that's going to completely destroy the entire trajectory of your child's education by having them in some type of innovative school that's like not quite the right fit for you. The probability of that happening is super low. That being said, I think when you're looking at schools, I think you first want to ask yourself, like, what do you value in your kid's education? Like, what is important to you when your kid turns 18 and they are ready to go out into the world and find their way and start forging their own path? What kind of person do you want them to be? What kind of skills do you want them to have? What do you want them to know how to do? What do you want to have them have in their tool belt as they're going out and engaging in the world? And I think if you use that as your starting point to start to build out, if you use that as like the first principles, the indivisible truth of what you know that you want, then you can start working backwards and thinking about how to get there. So if you want a child who thinks really entrepreneurially and is like really good at taking agency and saying like, I want to see this thing exist in my life or in the world at large and I want to build it, maybe you want to look at a school that really prioritizes agency. And so then you want to ask what kinds of models that I'm looking at are going to really support my child's development of agency. And then you start discovering that there are schools that have no teachers. They have guides who are there to make sure that the kids, kind of like coaches, so like making sure the kids have what they need to be successful, but they're not actually teaching the kids the academic subjects. Like the kids are kind of on their own figuring out how to do it. And maybe that really aligns with your value of agency, and that's who you want your kid to be when they're an adult. And you say, maybe this would be a really great experience for my kid. On the other hand, maybe your kid has a really hard time being self-directed and like really needs some external pushing to get on the right track during the day. And so your child, where they're at right now. And so you say, maybe this school with no teachers isn't the best fit for them right now. Like maybe in a few years they could fit inside that model, but I think I need to have them somewhere with more structure. But I really want my child to be like well read and exposed to the ideas of the Western canon when they graduate. So maybe I'm going to look for a classical school for my kid. So I think if you start thinking about what it is that you want your child to be, it makes it a lot easier to start looking at schools that describe those values. And then you want to just like ask yourself practical questions like, what's the price range that you're willing to spend? How far are you willing to drive to send your kid to school every day? Are you open to a school that's online, or do you only want to do something that's in person? Are you open to some type of hybrid thing where like half the day they're at school or half the week they're at school and half the week they're at home? Or do you need them to be out of the house full time because of the childcare component? So you can start kind of like thinking, I think if you ask the practical questions first, it eliminates a lot of options. And then from the ones that remain, then you can start asking like, okay, what's the student to teacher ratio? How many kids are in a class? How much time do they spend outside every day? What is the like academic standards that they're being measured on? Like, what's the testing schedule like? What are they going to be studying this year? Like, what are the academic requirements? What are they spending their time on? How much flexibility is there within the curriculum? You can start asking practical questions and then fitting the answers to those questions onto the sense that you have about what type of environment your kid's going to thrive in, and also what skills you want them to be learning. And I also think it's really important, and I always tell parents this too, trust your intuition about this. You're going to have, like, whenever you step off of the status quo path, all of the gatekeepers of the status quo path are going to freak out at you and say, no, you can't do this. Like, you're not qualified like we are. You don't have the credentialing to know what you're doing. You need to bring your child back to us immediately because they're not safe out there. And I think parents really need to trust their own intuition about what their child needs and where their child thrives, because no one has spent as much time with your child as you. No one knows your child as well as you do. And as long as you're listening to them and you're paying attention to them and you're coming at this from a place of like true intentionality about like, I want what's best for my kid, not just like what I think my kid should want, you know best where they're going to thrive. And you can trust that too when you're looking at schools and thinking about options for your kid. So that's where I usually tell parents to start. And we also have on the Rebel Educator website, rebeleducator.co, we have a bunch of resources where we have articles where we just like lay out the different types of questions that we recommend asking of a school. So you can find things there too that'll also give you, like, if you're actually a parent listening to this who's looking, that's where I would send you first, to start like listing out questions that you might want to ask when you start looking at different options.
There's a lot to think about there. I love what you said about experimenting and not being afraid to have your kid try a few different schools until you find the right fit. I mean, like anything else, you come at this with like a priori knowledge about what will be best. But as you also said, to think about your values and think about what you want for your kid. You said that, when they turn 18 and go out into the world, what kind of person do you want them to be? And I think that presupposes that by that point, they've really learned how to be independent, how to live independently, think for themselves, make their own decisions, think about what they want to do with their lives, and then go after it. And so, a lot of what you said about values reminds me, I think, of the importance of the actual philosophy of the education. And, there's obviously many practical considerations that you have to take into account, like how close and how much and this and that. But there are these competing educational philosophies out there, and perhaps they're less worked out for higher grade levels. I think there's a whole bunch of work to do in the field to figure out what is the best way to help young people become independent, responsible thinkers, people who have a moral compass, who understand the basics of how the world has come to be what it is, so they perhaps have to know something about history and how people of the past solved the problems that they had and how they might go about solving the problems that they face. So, some obvious ones that come to mind that people are probably already familiar with: Montessori, and now I think in the US at least that I hope I'm getting this right, Waldorf
Mhm.
education is at least for younger grades, now pretty competitive in popularity with Montessori. Are there other sort of educational philosophies, like schools of thought, that have a comprehensive view of what education ought to be, that people should familiarize themselves with before going out to sort of buy the product, so to speak?
Yeah. So there's another model of schooling that I would lump into a similar category with Montessori and Waldorf. It's called Reggio Emilia. It's kind of similar to both of those. Like I would classify in the same category, and I would put all of those loosely in a similar type of bucket. Like I think people who are interested in one tend to also gravitate towards the other. I think they have a lot of complementary qualities, even though each one is distinct. But I think there are a lot of different types of models. Um, and we live in a really, really interesting time in education. There's a lot of innovation happening, and there are a lot of people building really cool things. And at a rate that far exceeds what we've seen for a long time through history. Like, honestly, when you look at the history of education, the innovation is fairly stagnant. Like there's a lot of stuff that we do that the Greeks did. That we're like, we've innovated some on it, but we haven't innovated that much on it. And when you stop
Not
and
close,
think, you're like,
don't fix it, right? The Greeks were pretty smart.
they were, but at the same time, the world that we live in is dramatically different. And we've innovated in so many ways in so many other fields that it makes you stop and ask, like, do we really not know that much more else about how to educate a child than we did 2,500 years ago? Like, really? We know a lot more about medicine than we used to. We know a lot more about how the human body works. We know a lot more about how the brain works. You'd think we'd know more about that would change how we think about how we educate our kids. And the answer is like, we actually do know a lot more. The system just hasn't caught up. So I'm going to get back to answering your question in a second, but I think there's some like context here that's really important to like flesh out the claim that I'm going to make in actually answering your question, that there's a lot happening to be excited about. So for the past 50 to 60 years, there has been a ton of research done in most of the major universities in the country around a thing called learning science, which is basically the science of how we learn things. Tons of research has been done, tons of studies. We've learned a lot. And a lot of what we've learned indicates that the way we educate our kids is really ineffective and really backwards. Just the mechanics of it, not even, what should we be teaching kids, like from a subject matter standpoint, totally separate conversation. But just from like a mechanical how we're teaching kids, everything that we're doing is really inefficient and really ineffectual. We're teaching kids in ways that are not at all tailored to the natural learning progress and process and progression. And the way that we have kids memorize things, we test them on them, and then they don't have to recall them again for an extended period of time. There's so much wasted space for kids learn things, and I use air quotes because learning is a very relative term. If you can remember it for a couple weeks and spit it out on a test, but then you've forgotten it afterwards, does that count as learning it? Or is that just you like retained it in your short-term memory for a short period of time in order to complete a task, but then you've forgotten it again? Which is what's happening to our kids again and again. You see it. There's this thing like summer learning loss is a studied phenomenon where at the end of the school year, kids score a certain, they get a certain score on a test, and then they don't access that information for 2 or 3 months during the summer, and they come back and they test lower on the same subjects because they've forgotten things because they just haven't had to use them. Does that really count as learning? Like, or is learning, is there a long-term retention component to learning that's important? If we're making kids spend time on things, I would argue that you probably want them to remember them. You can argue like, sure, they're learning, some of the soft or the like sort of meta skills around how to learn and how to study and memorize things, and that's useful, but you don't have to be drilling that again and again and again. Once you've learned it, you kind of know how. So all of this research and learning science has been done. If people are curious, there's a really great study. It's called Bloom's 2 sigma problem. That was one of the landmark studies in the early 80s around how kids actually learn most effectively. And what was discovered is that kids learn best when they're given a small set of material to work through, whether it's math problems to solve or like formulas to memorize or whatever. They're given a small lesson, they practice it, they're quizzed on it immediately after, and then the next lesson that follows is adapted based on their test scores. So they do the quiz, and then you can see in real time, like these are the parts of the lesson that the child understands, and these are the parts that they don't. And then the next lesson covers the things that were incorrect on the test, loosely practices the things that were gotten right so that the child doesn't forget it. But then once everything is understood, then the new information is introduced. Which when I describe this, it sounds a lot like an app like Duolingo. That's exactly how Duolingo works. It's exactly how a lot of the learning apps that have been built over the past few years are designed, because they're using this scientific research that's been done on how we learn to build out their model. When this research was done in the 80s, the people who run the education system saw it, but there's no way to efficiently transfer this into the classroom model. Like if you have a teacher with 30 kids, she can't sit down and grade everybody's quiz real quick and then give everybody a custom lesson based on what they got right. So she teaches to the mean, and she does the best she can to make sure that she's, addressing sort of like the midpoint of where all the students in her class are at. But some kids are way ahead, some kids are way behind. The kids who are way behind may never catch up, but as long as they get like 60 to 70% of the questions right on every test, they get a passing grade, and they keep going, and they just keep building on the gaps, which is how our current system runs. Like that's how it functions. And so all of this research was done, and it wasn't scalable inside of the traditional model. Like there's just no way a teacher can do anything with this information. However, now that we have all this technology, this explosion of new technology, we can start building tools that can do what a teacher cannot. And so we have this huge explosion of AI tutors, and like machine learning algorithms that can be baked into learning software that can help kids use what we've learned scientifically to be true about how people learn to help kids like actually learn things exactly at their speed and without the gaps. So there are a lot of really interesting schooling models. I promised I was going to bring this back. There are a lot of really interesting schooling models that are using this scientific research and the technology tools that we now have at our disposal to build out different types of educational approaches. So you have like the Montessori, Waldorf, Reggio Emilia category that is like that's its own category. I would consider it to be of schools. Then you have the schools that are they're very technologically driven, they're highly innovative, and they're replacing the standard teacher in front of a classroom model with technological tools. A lot of them are smaller schools, a lot of them are localized, some of them are fully online. There's kind of a whole different range of approaches, but a lot of them are kind of hybrids between just using the technological tools with like some other educational philosophy built on top of it. So some of them are democratic schools, some of them are like they're using like project-based learning for the rest of their academic topics. So like kids are drilling on the academic topics via like apps and stuff, and then they're using the rest of their day to build out projects. There are a few different schools that are running models like that, which are super cool. So that's another category. Then there are micro schools, which are, I think, like one room schoolhouse for the 21st century. It's usually a mixed age range one teacher typically. Sometimes it's like 3 or 4 teachers in like different classrooms, but it's like a very small localized community school. And again, these can also use the technological tools that these like tech driven schools are using to teach each child at their own grade level. You can have a room full of 10 kids, grades 3 through 6. Each one's at a totally different place in their journey learning math. The teacher doesn't have to be teaching to every single child where they're at. The teacher can be helping each kid use a tech tool to like practice their math. And then the teacher can sit down and help the kids work through problems when they get stuck. So the teacher is scalable across the model because she's not constrained to every single learning need of every single teacher. She can or every single student. She can outsource a lot of like what a teacher traditionally would do to the tech tool, which is super exciting. There's a lot of, I think we're just seeing the very beginning of innovation with what tech tools can do to change education. But micro schools are another category. And then you get all kinds of other like innovative models that people build out. Like there's self-directed learning centers where it's kind of like a WeWork for kids, where the kids show up and like they're all doing different academic stuff. Like some of them are in online schools, some of them are like being homeschooled and they just like go hang out for the day to socialize. But it's just like a space where kids can go. And like some of these learning centers have like it's a full package education, and for some it's more just like a location kids can go to while they're inside other models. Lots of people are building really cool online schools. There are some people building what they call world schools, which is basically like enrollments are open to kids anywhere on the globe, so you can be taking a class in medieval poetry with a kid in Singapore and a kid in Australia and a kid in Austria and a kid in Alberta, Canada. And you can just like, be making friends all over the world and learning about different people's cultures and traditions while you're also in school, which is super cool. So there's tons and tons of stuff being built. And I really think we're still in the early stages of innovation on this front because the landscape, like people are hungry for new education options, especially post pandemic. People, like everybody saw school come home and everybody was kind of unhappy with what they saw. And people are much more ready for change in education than they were pre 2020. And so I really think we're in the early stages of a pretty big wave of education innovation. So I think we're going to see a lot more really cool models start to emerge over the next few years, which I'm super stoked about.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the hybrids that you mentioned. One of the reasons actually that I decided to have a kid, and maybe kids plural, but right now a kid, was because I got on an airplane and a mother came to me and she apologized to me. She said, "I'm really sorry. My two little boys are going to be sitting with you because I'm going to be sitting back there with my newborn, well, my much younger infant. And but don't worry, they have their iPads and that will occupy them." And she wasn't joking because I actually tried to engage with them and I was kind of curious. We were sitting close to the wing. We were going over interesting cities, really cool scenery, and there's the landing gear and like pointing out how the technology works. But they didn't engage like at all. And they were just glued to the technology. And so, as a new parent, I'm like, this is one of the things that I worry about is, and already I'm like not showing my little Leo, I'm not showing him the phone, and we already didn't really watch much TV, so we don't have really a whole lot of screen time, and I'm worried about him getting, sucked into it to the exclusion of other things. So the idea that there are these hybrid models at the least where we can both take advantage of a scalable technology, but also ensure that they get some social time, some interaction with human beings, and somebody that can sort of relate what it is that they're learning from an app to their own life experience. That to me sounds really interesting and really cool. So I hope to see more of that. World schooling is also a really interesting concept. I mean, it's one of the things that I thought perhaps we would do individually. Like, we'll probably homeschool and we can take Leo on little trips to say we want to learn about history. Well, we could go to Greece or we could go to Italy and to your other parts of Europe and see it there in the flesh and learn about it there. So that people are doing this with online tools, or at least offering courses that you couldn't get any other way, I think is fascinating. Um, are you a proponent of just tutors in general, or are you working with a lot of parents that are tapping into, like, I guess what I'm getting at is there are a whole bunch of like college students out there. Maybe they're working on a PhD or something, and they're basically broke because they're putting all of their focus into school, but they know the subjects really well. Um, what do you think about that opportunity to sort of leverage their expertise?
So I love this, and there's actually someone building something very similar to what you just described. I had her on my podcast a month or two ago. Her name's Audrey Wish, and she's building a company called Curious Cardinals, where she's a Stanford dropout who was at Stanford and started connecting her friends to people in her network who are looking for tutors for their kids. And so she's building out this whole network of college students who are tutoring. Like they work with like kids K through 12, like the whole range. You can find college students who have expertise in different areas that the kid might be interested in or be struggling and need help with, and they can connect them to a tutor. I think tutoring is awesome. I think tutoring is like it was all of the elites throughout history, like all of the monarchs and powerful business families and whatever, like they all had tutors for their children for a reason, because it is great. It's not necessarily super scalable to have like every child on the planet raised by a private tutor. Like I think that there are elements of the model of tutoring that can be scaled out. Like, maybe you use different, like, I think there are a lot of different ways that you can kind of like blend using different tools to make it easier. Where, I mean, the other thing about technology is it allows you to learn from the best teacher on the planet in every topic. So the market kind of like brings the most competent person to the top, and you can learn. Like Khan Academy is a great example of this. Salman Khan is just really great at teaching math, and any kid on the planet can log onto their browser and learn from Salt Khan, which is super cool. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But I think, the more that you can expose your kids to great mentors, great coaches, great role models, I think that's such an important facet of learning. Because like you said, like you do need to translate what's happening on a screen out into reality. It's really important. We don't live in our computers, we use them as tools. We live in the world. And so having people who can help you bridge out into the world and help guide you in learning how to navigate it and be a role model for you of what you could possibly become is really important. And I think that there are if you have a child and you're using technical tools to help support them in their learnings, I think you also want to be looking really actively for like who are the people that they can be building connections with, because we're also really social creatures, right? So we need the human connection too, to varying extents depending on the personality. But like generally speaking, you need some human connection in order to make all of it real. Um, so I think the nice thing about the internet is it makes it really easy to find people who have interests similar to those of your child, or skill sets or maybe challenges or disabilities that are similar to your child, that you can put them in front of and help someone that can help understand them and support them and help them navigate the things, whatever your kid's going through. Whether it's like, I really want to write novels and I feel like I don't know anybody else who even likes novels, so I feel very alone. Or a kid who's like, well, I'm really dyslexic and it's really hard for me to read all of these things, but also I have, aspirations that require, reading through this content. Having somebody who's succeeded in the realm that they want to succeed at, who's also dyslexic, is incredibly powerful. So I'm a huge proponent of the real connections. I think that's one of the most important parts of an education.
Yeah, I love to hear you say that. I mean, one obvious way to leverage tutors, because like you said, not everybody can have a tutor for their child, particularly in every subject. But if you're gonna maybe dip your toe into the water of homeschooling and you have some expertise, maybe you're like a pharmacist and you can teach like chemistry and maybe a bit of biology and things like that, but your weak point is say like history. Well, you can just find somebody who can teach that one subject, right? And fill in your gaps essentially by using the technology. I want to connect all of this because we've been talking mostly, I think, in the context of like K through 12. And so we should probably connect this to higher ed. And that's, I know when we talked last, we kind of focused on that because you were working at Praxis then, which is an alternative to college education. Um, have there been many developments in that sort of part of the spectrum? And what, if anything, is Rebel Educator doing with, those people who are maybe on the fence about going to college, and not really sure what to do?
Yeah, so we're very like I consider Rebel Educator to be in the education commentary business, just like across the board, everything from preschool all the way through to, continuing education as an adult. We specialize in K-12, like that tends to be the highest concentration of both what we talk about and also what our audience is looking for. But we definitely have a lot to say and have created a lot of content around the college stuff too. And I, like in my own personal brand, I talk about it a lot because that's a huge part of my story. And so I've, as you know, I've spent years working in the college alternative space. And so I just have, and that was, I didn't go to college and kind of like had to figure it out. So I talk about this a lot. But I think there are a couple like core things that I think are just like momentum trends within the college world. So not going to college has become much more socially acceptable than it was even half a decade ago, definitely a decade ago. There's a lot more common to hear people talking about the pros and the cons and like weighing the balance. And I think people are much more open to the idea that you can be successful without a college degree. There are a lot more stories and case studies about this. There's a lot more work to do to make people feel comfortable opting out, but it's definitely getting easier than it used to be. There also is, you know, there's an exodus from academia of intellectuals, which is really interesting to watch unfolding. There are a lot of, cancel culture has really taken its toll on academia. And there are a lot of people who really aren't happy about that. There are a lot of people with a lot of clout and a lot of respect and a large audience who are exiting the system. And that's going to, I think, have ripple effects that we're only just starting to see in the conversation of how we think about higher education. The University of Austin has been, I think, announced, I think since we talked, I think it was late 2021 that they first announced what they were building. Still too early to be able to tell how that is going to unfold what they're building there, but there's a lot of momentum and support from a lot of people with large audiences and a lot of influence who are helping to build that out. And so, that's a really interesting change in the conversation around education. You kind of have like academia at large, and then you have this new heterodox university that's like very loudly championing free speech and freedom of thought as like and positioning themselves like we are very much counter to everything else that is happening in the university system at large. So I think the monopoly it's very far from being broken, but there are cracks in the veneer that weren't there before. I think a decade ago, if you were smart and ambitious and you decided not to go to college, people were just like, they're either going to be the next Steve Jobs or insane. I guess one or the other. And if they're the next Steve Jobs, they're still probably insane. But it's like you're either going to be a billionaire or you're going to end up sleeping under a bridge. Like those were your kind of like options. And I think now it's much more accepted that you cannot go to college and you can be totally okay. And I think as that becomes more and more accepted, this stronghold that college has over being the exclusive path to financial and career success, if you didn't want to work in the blue collar sector, is starting to fade. It's starting to crack. And that's, once a crack is there, it gets bigger, right? So I think the bubble hasn't fully burst yet, but I definitely think the conversation is really different than it was even a couple of years ago.
Yeah, I've heard of some people, and I think this works better for certain career paths than others. But for instance, somebody that wants to learn how to code, wants to learn about computers, they're now, as far as I understand, I haven't gone through them, but full curriculums online where you can basically give yourself a world-class education without even paying a dime. A lot of these are
Yeah.
free, is that right?
Yeah, there are a lot of boot camps that are been established, both that are like charging tuition and you can like go through them as a program, and then also just free resources online if you are willing to put in the elbow grease to like piece together everything that you need. Yeah, the boot camp marketplace has really exploded too. There are tons, it's not just for coding, it's for all different, there's sales boot camps, marketing boot camps, like whatever you want to learn how to do, there are boot camps for it. Um, there's a
Yeah,
lot
you even
happening
talked
there.
earlier about how a couple of years ago you were teaching a course on opportunity for us at Objective Standard Institute. So we have courses, they're not college accredited courses, but we don't really think that's necessary. Uh,
No.
to get value out of these things, to learn about life-serving ideas, to learn about the history of individual rights or education or how to appreciate literature, you don't have to go to a college today. There's a huge competition with colleges online. It's a beautiful thing, I think. I think that competition is driving up the value that people can find now and for a whole lot less money. So it's really
Mm-hmm.
incredible. Before we wrap up, I wanted to talk a little bit about your branding agency. Honestly, I think you told me about this, but let me just, plead new dad here and lack of sleep for uh for kind of I guess forgetting that you were doing this, and tell me a little bit more about it and tell others like what is it you're doing, who is it really for, and what can they get from it?
Yeah, so it's entirely possible that we have not talked about this. It's kind of been in stealth mode, so you may not be forgetting anything. I mentioned it and then I forgot I've mentioned it or if I've mentioned it. Like this thing doesn't even like have an actual name for like this as like a separate entity from the other things that I'm building. Like it's the kind of thing I've joked with the people who work for me. It's like we should just like make a website that just says like if you're here you already know what we do. Like, here's our email address. Like, so, like if you found this, you already know. Like, we don't have to market anything because we're not like right now we're just functioning off of
Flow.
inbound leads. Um, and most people find us through Rebel Educator, the work that I do. So basically, the agency was born out of the idea that like before I started Rebel Educator, I had these other clients. I was kind of like trying to figure out like how I like piece all of these different things together, but also like as I'm building out all of these skills and doing. So I have a small team of absolutely phenomenal content creators that I can brag about all day. They are amazing. Mostly sourced from Praxis. That so I got to earmark them long ago as people I wanted to work with someday. Um, but um, so basically we do the same types of things that we do with Rebel Educator. So we work with people who are building out brands that aren't just like we have a tech product and so we need like SEO driven blog posts to drive people back to our site. We want to work with people who are super mission driven and who we want to like not only are they mission driven, but it's a vision of the world that we're excited about furthering to.
Mhm.
So right now, most of our clients are in the education world just because that's where a lot of my connections are. But the goal is not to stay just in education. We're expanding out some. But basically, we do the same types of things that we do with Rebel Educators. So we come in and we're like, we can help you build out social media brands. We can help you build out like web content that is SEO optimized, but it's also like very mission driven. It's a little more publication like thought piece kind of content. Um, but we also help with like big picture strategy of like where do you fit into the bigger landscape of conversations that are happening that are tangential to what you're doing? What are you offering that's different? What is your stance on issues that are kind of spicy and a lot of people steer clear of, but you maybe have strong opinions about, but you're not sure if you actually want to say them publicly? Like, what do you want to say? What do you want to stand for? What is your take on different things? How are you positioning that? How are you like what are kind of like the core pillars of what you believe? A lot of people have a lot of really strong ideas about the world, but they haven't necessarily like sat down and parsed out like, okay, these are like the top 5 things that like we really want to get across and we really believe. And usually it's pretty clear to an outside observer who knows what they're looking for. It's just hard to parse out when you're like in it and you're the one thinking about it all the time. So we kind of help people like figure out what those things are that they want to say. And then we help them figure out like what the positioning strategy is to be the person on the internet who's the expert in that thing. And that's actually like driving meaningful change and convincing somebody of something. Is it, is a strategy to go publish pieces with third-party publications? Is it to get on a bunch of podcasts? Is it to grow a Twitter audience? Is it something else? So we do like all the same types of questions that I've had to ask building Rebel Educator, and all the same skills that I've had to building Rebel Educator, just like figuring out how do I scale those to help other people whose missions I'm also really excited about, even to the point that like if I wasn't building Rebel Educator, maybe I'd want to be working on this with you, but like I'm already doing this other thing, but like let me help you by helping you figure out a lot of things that I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into learning and maybe save you a lot of time. So that's what we do. It's kind of like just grown very organically and informally. Like it's just word of mouth referrals. People come in. And if it's a fit, if we're aligned and there are people in my network who are interested in the specific topic that they're working on that can help with the actual content creation side of things, then maybe a partnership forms. It's been super fun. It honestly feels like such a great little ecosystem where the things that I'm building bring in potential clients, and then working with those clients helps me better understand what's working with Rebel Educator so I can keep going there. So like it all feeds back into itself. But yeah, I really should have like a website for it or something. Right now, when people are interested, I'm like, yeah, just like DM me on Twitter, on my personal Twitter, Hannah Frankman, or like send me an email and we'll talk and we'll figure out if it's a fit. Eventually we'll probably have like an actual landing page for the agency and stuff, but right now we haven't even needed to have one. It's just all inbound leads.
Yeah, I feel like to some extent I'm already a client and I didn't even know the company existed. I ping you for advice and we talk about things. It's super helpful. So I can certainly vouch for it to that extent. It's fantastic.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, this is such an interesting conversation. I'm really excited that you're doing this, in part because, new parent here, and I don't know all of this stuff. I don't have the time to go digging through the just mountains of information about all these schools. So I really am going to keep a close eye on how you progress. And for others who don't already know about how to follow you or to find your work, where should they go?
If you're on Twitter, you can find my personal Twitter at Hannah Frankman, and everything is linked from there. The Rebel Educator Twitter account is at Rebel Educator. If you're not on Twitter, you can go to rebeleducator.co, and that's the landing page for all of the articles and the content we've created via Rebel Educator. My podcast, the Hannah Frankman podcast, is available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. Please follow me on YouTube. I have a lot more Spotify followers than I do YouTube followers, but YouTube's the number people actually can see. So if you want to do me a solid, you can help me up that number a little bit. I'm kind of kidding, but also I'm kind of not. The podcast is on Instagram at Hannah Frankman Podcast. So whatever platform you're on, you can probably find me. But yeah, that's where people can dig in. You can DM me on Twitter if you have questions. And if you liked this, you should definitely check out the podcast because I talk to people every week about all different types of niche education topics, and it's super fun. I'm going to have Craig Biddle on shortly. I interviewed him. His interview is one of the ones queued up. So for listeners here who are interested in listening to Craig and I wax philosophical about education for a while, that episode will be out soon.
Yeah, Craig was a co-host of this show for a long time, but yeah, then he ditched me, and now he's having fun talking to people like Hannah, which is fine. I'll continue, continue flourishing, and I hope everybody's really taking as much from this as I certainly am. Thank you again, Hannah, so much for coming on the show, and let's not let it be another like 2.5 years before we talk again. I want to check in and see how things are going much sooner. All right.
Well, hopefully the growth will be accelerating, so there will be more to talk about soon, but we'll see.
Absolutely. I can bet on it.
Amazing. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Hannah.